August 19th, 1944. In a dimly lit command room in East Prussia, German generals bent over their maps, convinced they had cracked the code of American warfare. General Alfred Jodl calculated the distances, the gallons of fuel, the tons of ammunition. To him, the answer was inevitable. The Americans had outrun their lifeline. No army in history, he believed, could maintain such reckless speed. He whispered to his staff, "Within 48 hours, Patton will stop." But outside, beyond the range of German imagination, a miracle of steel and willpower was already roaring to life. 5,958 trucks, engines shaking the ground, headlights blazing against every rule of military discipline, moved eastward in an endless chain. Each carried 5 tons of supplies, each driver defying exhaustion, each convoy writing a new law of modern war. What the Germans thought impossible was about to become the Americans' greatest weapon. This was not the work of generals. It was the work of drivers, 23,000 of them, 3 out of every 4 African American, men who could not sit in the same restaurants as their white comrades back home, yet who carried the burden of keeping George Patton's Third Army alive. They named their convoys Patton's Blood Bank, Detroit to Berlin Express, painted slogans on olive-drab trucks, and laughed at the odds. On the roads of France, war no longer sounded like artillery. It sounded like engines that never stopped. It sounded like democracy carried forward at 35 miles per hour. This is the story of the Red Ball Express, the moment when logistics became strategy, when trucks became weapons, and when ordinary men behind the wheel turned the tide of history. The German General Staff prided itself on mathematics. War, to them, was not just courage and steel, but numbers, columns, and the cold precision of fuel consumption tables. They remembered Russia. In 1941, the Wehrmacht had thundered across the steppes in a storm of tanks and aircraft, believing Blitzkrieg to be invincible. Yet by the time they reached Smolensk, the supply chain had already stretched thin. Trucks bogged down in mud, horse-drawn wagons, still 80% of German transport, lagged hopelessly behind. Ammunition piled up on railheads because the Soviet rail gauge did not match German tracks. The Soviet counterblows had been terrible, but in truth, it was logistics, not resistance, that slowed Hitler's armies first. By 1944, every German staff officer knew the tyranny of distance. They studied the Americans with cold detachment, applying the same grim calculations. A Sherman tank consumed half a mile per gallon on the road, worse across open country. An infantry division required 700 tons of supplies every day. An armored division, 1,000 tons. Patton commanded 12 divisions racing across a 60-mile front, already 400 miles from the beaches of Normandy. 12,000 tons a day. Over broken bridges, cratered roads, and railways the retreating Germans had carefully destroyed. Even if, the German officers said, the Americans had unlimited trucks, which they did not. Even if they had perfect roads, which they did not. Even if not a single vehicle failed, which was impossible, the advance could not last longer than 48 hours. The Germans trusted the arithmetic of scarcity. They measured every gallon, every tire, every horse. They assumed the Americans must do the same. What they could not imagine was that the United States measured war differently. American commanders did not treat waste as failure. They treated it as margin for victory. On August 20th, in a requisitioned chateau near Leh, Lieutenant Colonel Laurent Ayres of the Motor Transport Service stood before a room of skeptical officers. He had listened to their calculations, to their predictions of collapse, and then he announced something that sounded insane. "We are going to build a one-way highway," he said, "from the beaches to the front. Every vehicle will run 20 hours out of 24. There will be no stops, except for gas or emergencies. We will move 12,500 tons daily, minimum." The officers shifted in their seats. Traditional supply methods had already collapsed. Railway transport was too slow. Scheduled convoys could not keep up with Patton's tanks. Depot-to-depot distribution failed under the strain. Yet Ayres insisted. He borrowed the term Red Ball from American railroads, where Red Ball freight meant absolute priority. Nothing could interfere. This highway system would be the same. 2 parallel lanes, 1 eastbound for loaded trucks, 1 westbound for empties. Military police would clear anything that slowed to below 25 miles per hour. Convoys would depart every 5 minutes. Headlights would blaze all night. violating blackout rules. Mobile repair units would work roadside, swapping engines in 45 minutes, cannibalizing broken vehicles, triaging every problem in 15 minutes or less. To the Germans, such a scheme would have been unthinkable. To the Americans, it was the only option. Within 36 hours, the Red Ball Express came to life. 5,958 vehicles, mostly GMC 2.5-ton trucks nicknamed the Deuce and a Half, roared onto the French highways. Their mission? To feed Patton's Third Army and keep it moving east. The drivers themselves gave the convoys a soul. 23,000 men climbed behind the wheels. 75% of them African-American soldiers serving in a segregated army. Denied equal rights at home, excluded from combat commands, these men found themselves at the center of the most vital supply line in modern history. They painted slogans across their trucks. Hitler, here we come, Patton's blood bank, Detroit, to Berlin Express. They invented rules of their own. Slower vehicles pulled off immediately, mechanical failures pushed into ditches, any truck below 20 miles per hour declared a roadblock. In a matter of hours, they created not just a convoy system, but a living culture of speed, improvisation, and pride. German intelligence first reported the phenomenon with disbelief. Reconnaissance units described endless columns of headlights stretching 20 kilometers into the night, thousands of vehicles running nose to tail without blackout discipline, an open invitation to artillery or air attack. The Americans, one officer noted, have abandoned every rule of military science. But this was no mistake. It was a deliberate violation of convention, born of confidence in American industry and an understanding of war that Germany could not fathom. Where the Wehrmacht prized concealment, the Americans trusted mass. Where Germans counted every vehicle, the Americans assumed 30% would fail and planned for it. Where Germans demanded rigid hierarchy, the Americans delegated authority down to lieutenants and sergeants, trusting them to make decisions that, in Berlin, required the approval of a field marshal. It was messy, it was wasteful, and it was unstoppable. The first week told the story. Between August 25th and August 31st, the Red Ball Express delivered nearly 90,000 tons of supplies, an average of 12,800 tons daily, matching and even exceeding Ayres's audacious promise. Round trips stretched 600 miles, but the system absorbed the strain. 5,000 trucks made 1.5 trips each day, burning 300,000 gallons of gasoline just to fuel their own operations. The Germans dismissed the numbers as propaganda. They could not accept that such a thing was possible, but it was, and the numbers would only grow. In the greater context of the Chientrange, the Gioilan II, the Red Ball Express represented a turning point. For the first time, logistics was not just supporting combat, it was dictating strategy. Patton's tanks did not slow when arithmetic said they must. They accelerated, because behind them, an invisible army of drivers had turned scarcity into abundance and impossibility into motion. The Germans prided themselves on discipline, order, precision, concealment. These were the cornerstones of their doctrine. When reconnaissance units peered from the hedgerows of France in late August 1944, what they saw along the Red Ball routes defied everything they had been taught. Continuous convoys stretched beyond the horizon. Headlights blazed openly at night. Trucks rumbled nose to tail in long chains, inviting artillery or airstrikes. There was no camouflage, no spacing, no concealment. German officers reported with astonishment, "The enemy operates a supply system beyond our comprehension. Vehicles pass at 30-second intervals, day and night, without pause. They do not hide. They do not disperse. They do not obey rules we understand. It is not military science. It is mass production applied to warfare." What German observers did not grasp was that this chaos was deliberate. American logistics had embraced volume over finesse, redundancy over precision, speed over perfection. By August 28th, German units monitoring the routes noted a staggering pace, nearly 1,000 vehicles per hour. By September 5th, the Red Ball Express had reached a rhythm that seemed impossible to German minds. Convoys departed every 5 minutes from the western terminus. Each convoy averaged 67 vehicles. Each truck carried 5 tons, often overloaded to 7. The one-way route covered 350 miles. Round trips stretched 14 hours each way, with only 2 hours of turnaround at depots. 5,000 trucks were always moving, day and night, in perpetual motion. The mathematics that German generals trusted had been broken by American improvisation. Every single day, approximately 1,800 trucks broke down. But instead of collapsing, the system adapted. Mobile repair units were stationed every 50 miles. Mechanics developed a triage method. If it could be fixed in 15 minutes, it was fixed on the roadside. If not, the truck was pushed into a ditch and stripped for parts. Engines were swapped in 45 minutes using mobile cranes. Tires were replaced by the thousands each week. To Germans who cherish careful maintenance schedules and rationed parts, such waste was madness. To Americans, it was strategy. The culture of the drivers made the system come alive. 23,000 men, 75% of them African American, operated in a segregated army that denied them equal rights. Yet here, behind the wheel, they held the fate of Europe in their hands. They painted their trucks with slogans: Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler, Here We Come, Detroit to Berlin Express. They invented their own rules of the road. Slower vehicles pulled off immediately, breakdowns pushed aside without hesitation. They formed a brotherhood of exhaustion and pride. Some stories became legend. Corporal John L. Houston drove for 48 hours straight, delivering ammunition to the 2nd Armored Division, falling asleep at the wheel 3 times, but continuing after fellow drivers revived him. Private Booker T. Washington's truck caught fire while carrying medical supplies. Instead of abandoning it, as regulations required, he drove the burning vehicle 2 miles to a field hospital before jumping out, saving the cargo that kept wounded men alive. German intelligence officers who interviewed prisoners later admitted their confusion. Nazi racial theory declared African Americans incapable of such responsibility. Yet here they were, delivering miracles of logistics, disproving Hitler with every mile. One captured German officer confessed, "We knew we had lost when we understood your supply system. You violated every rule, wasted fuel, abandoned vehicles, exhausted drivers, yet you succeeded through sheer volume. You industrialized warfare beyond our comprehension." The numbers spoke for themselves. Between August 25th and 31st, nearly 90,000 tons of supplies were delivered. Daily averages exceeded 12,800 tons. In the first weeks of September, Patton's 4th Armored Division advanced 35 miles in the morning, paused for resupply, then advanced another 32 miles in the afternoon. German planning assumed no armored force could advance more than 30 miles in a day. The Red Ball Express shattered those assumptions, doubling the pace of modern mechanized warfare. German commanders could not reconcile what they saw. Field Marshal Walter Model, reviewing intelligence reports, concluded bitterly, "If these reports are accurate, we face not a superior army, but a superior civilization. They waste because they have infinite resources. They do not hide because they do not fear us. We cannot defeat this with military tactics." Patton's advance, which should have frozen by German mathematics, instead accelerated. German soldiers at the front heard the convoys every night, the endless drone of engines carrying supplies. The sound itself became psychological warfare. It meant the Americans would not stop. It meant that every German calculation of scarcity was irrelevant. For civilians along the route, the convoys became a symbol of liberation. French children gathered by the roadside to beg for candy or soap, which drivers handed out despite regulations. Villagers saw in the endless line of trucks proof that American victory was inevitable. German reports noted a 4-fold increase in resistance activity wherever Red Ball convoys passed. The abundance contrasted sharply with years of German occupation, when every scrap of food was rationed and scarcity was a way of life. By early September, the Red Ball Express faced its own crisis. The round trip had grown to 700 miles. Drivers collapsed from exhaustion. Trucks disintegrated under relentless strain. Convoy intervals slipped from 5 minutes to 15. German observers noted the slowing pace and predicted collapse. But within 72 hours, the Americans reorganized. They created intermediate transfer points to shorten individual runs, rotated drivers to reduce fatigue, doubled the number of vehicles assigned. By September 12th, tonnage delivery had actually increased. What should have been the breaking point instead made the system stronger. It was not elegant. It was not efficient. But it was effective, and effectiveness was all that mattered. the Germans began to understand the truth. American logistics was not bound by the rules of European warfare. It was an entirely new philosophy, born from Detroit's assembly, lines and carried into France by men who refused to quit. And as the convoys thundered eastward, they carried not only fuel and ammunition, but a message. In this war, it would not be German discipline or German genius that prevailed. It would be American abundance, American improvisation, and the willpower of 23,000 drivers who turned highways into history. If you believe peace is worth fighting for, then say Amen in the comments below. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express had proven itself unstoppable. Yet, even miracles strained under their own weight. The round trip stretched to more than 700 miles. Drivers hallucinated from exhaustion, many operating for 72 straight hours on little more than stimulants and black coffee. Trucks broke down in staggering numbers, over 1,800 daily. German intelligence noted with satisfaction that convoy intervals, once 5 minutes apart, had slowed to 15. At last, they wrote, the Americans faced the collapse we endured in Russia. But collapse never came. Within 72 hours, the Americans adapted. They created intermediate transfer points so no driver had to endure the entire distance. They rotated crews to rest men without halting vehicles. They established forward maintenance bases closer to the front, and they doubled the number of trucks assigned. Instead of crumbling, the system surged. By September 12th, daily tonnage actually increased. German observers could only shake their heads. The crisis that should have halted Patton instead made the Red Ball Express stronger. Then came the skies. To supplement the convoys, American commanders unleashed an innovation the Wehrmacht considered impossible: aerial supply on a massive scale. C-47 transport planes roared overhead, each carrying 3 tons of ammunition or rations. On September 16th alone, 900 flights delivered 2,700 tons to forward units. German officers compared it bitterly to Stalingrad, where the Luftwaffe at its peak had managed 300 tons daily and considered it a maximum effort. The Americans treated aircraft as trucks with wings, unconcerned about losses, confident in numbers. Once again, industrial arithmetic overwhelmed military tradition. Autumn turned to winter. Freezing rain and snow descended across France. German doctrine declared wheeled logistics impossible below 10 degrees Celsius. Yet, the Red Ball Express did not stop. Drivers wrapped chains on tires, poured alcohol into radiators, and kept rolling. Convoy speeds dropped from 35 miles per hour to 15. But deliveries continued. German observers reported with disbelief that American trucks moved through blizzards that had immobilized entire panzer divisions. They built faster than we could destroy, one captured engineer admitted. They created roads overnight in fields we thought impassable. The cost was staggering. By late September, mechanical attrition consumed vehicles at rates no European army could have endured. Average truck life was only 10,000 miles, 1/3 of design expectations. 30% of vehicles were sidelined on any given day. Engines were replaced at a rate of 500 weekly. Tires wore out 10,000 at a time. More than 5,000 trucks were destroyed or abandoned. Yet still the convoys rolled because American factories had anticipated the waste. Ships arrived weekly at French ports carrying hundreds of new vehicles, ready to replace whatever broke. Replacement drivers trained in 2 days, then joined the endless stream of convoys. To the Wehrmacht, such waste seemed madness. To the Americans, it was simply overhead in a war of abundance. Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee put it plainly. We wore out 5,000 trucks and 23,000 men to destroy the German army in France. In any previous war, those would be catastrophic losses. In an industrial war, it is acceptable overhead. German morale cracked. Soldiers at the front could hear the convoys all night, the drone of engines echoing across the valleys. They had 3 rounds of ammunition per rifle, while the Americans delivered millions. The sound of trucks became as terrifying as the sound of artillery. In some sectors, American psychological warfare units broadcasted recordings of engine noise toward German lines. Soldiers reported hearing ghost convoys, even when none were present, proof of the psychological damage. One field marshal admitted, "We are not fighting an army. We are fighting their factories." For French civilians, the convoys were a revelation. Children gathered at the roadside to beg for chocolate, cigarettes, and soap, gifts the drivers handed out freely despite orders. To a population that had lived under German scarcity, the abundance was overwhelming. German intelligence reports admitted the propaganda impact. Civilians now believe American victory inevitable. Resistance activity has increased 400% along Red Ball routes. Where German occupation had ruled by rationing, Americans ruled by generosity. The racial reality of the Red Ball Express was perhaps its greatest irony. 75% of its drivers were African American soldiers serving in a segregated army, denied equal rights at home, barred from combat commands. They now held the power to keep the most celebrated white generals in history moving forward. General Eisenhower visited the convoys in September, watching exhausted men who had been at the wheel for 20 straight hours. He turned to his aide and said, "These men are winning the war as surely as any infantry. We need to reconsider many things." In the crucible of the Chien Tranche, the Gioiland II, seeds of desegregation were sown, as the contributions of African American drivers could no longer be denied. The financial cost was equally immense. By November 1944, the Red Ball Express had cost roughly $100 million. Trucks destroyed, fuel consumed, roads damaged, French claims for property losses. To German staff officers, managing scarcity daily, the figure was incomprehensible. Yet for the Americans, it was a bargain. Each day of war cost the United States $250 million. By shortening the war by an estimated 6 months, the Red Ball Express paid for itself many times over. Its legacy extended far beyond the battlefield. When the convoys were finally dissolved in November, their methods reshaped logistics forever. The veterans returned home with experience operating the largest transportation network in history. They founded trucking companies, pioneered interstate highways, and transformed civilian logistics. Companies like Yellow Freight and Roadway traced their origins to Red Ball veterans who had learned in France that volume beats efficiency, speed beats perfection, and if trucks keep rolling 24 hours a day, they can move the world. The Germans, meanwhile, studied the Red Ball Express after the war with a mixture of awe and despair. They had dismissed American logistics as wasteful, chaotic, impossible to sustain. But their own officers admitted the truth. Blitzkrieg had revolutionized tactics but never solved the problem of supply. The Americans had solved it, not with elegance but with overwhelming abundance. One German general summarized it bitterly. "We prepared for everything, your tanks, your planes, your ships. We never prepared for your trucks." In the autumn of 1944, the highways of France echoed with an unending roar. 6,000 trucks, 23,000 drivers, and more than 400,000 tons of supplies poured forward in 82 days. These were not glamorous machines of war. They were ordinary vehicles, battered, overloaded, sometimes burning, yet always moving. And in their movement lay the fate of an entire campaign. The Red Ball Express proved that logistics was not the shadow of strategy, but its beating heart. German generals who once laughed at American wastefulness found themselves silenced by convoys that defied every rule of military science. They had believed tanks and tactics would decide the war. Instead, they watched as convoys of trucks, driven mostly by young African American soldiers denied equality at home, became the decisive weapon of Europe. The legacy of the Red Ball Express is measured not only in tons of fuel and ammunition, but in lives saved and months of war shortened. Historians estimate the operation cut 6 months from the conflict, sparing hundreds of thousands of lives. For each day the trucks rolled, the end of the war drew closer. For each mile, the hopes of liberation grew stronger. World War II was not just the clash of tanks on battlefields or planes in the skies. It was also the thunder of convoys across broken roads, carrying freedom one load at a time. The impact extended far beyond victory in 1945. The drivers who returned to the United States built companies, pioneered highways, and shaped the modern trucking industry. Their experience on French roads laid the foundation for the logistics system that fuels our daily lives today. And their courage, particularly the courage of African American drivers, challenged a segregated nation to live up to its own ideals of freedom and justice. In World War II, the Red Ball Express was not a footnote. It was a turning point. It showed that in an industrial age, abundance defeats scarcity, improvisation outpaces perfection, and determination breaks through every obstacle. And after World War II, its lesson endured. Victory belongs not only to soldiers with rifles, but to the men and women who keep the supplies flowing, who turn endurance into triumph, who prove that in war as in peace, the lifeline matters as much as the front line. So, let us remember those 23,000 drivers, mostly young and often unrecognized, who drove through exhaustion, weather, and danger to deliver freedom at 35 miles per hour. They deserve a place in history alongside the most celebrated generals. If this story moves you, do not scroll away. Share it, comment your thoughts, and tell us what value you believe is most worth defending today. Do you think the greatest lesson of this era was that logistics determines victory, or that ordinary people, given the tools and trust, can achieve the impossible? The Red Ball Express answered those questions in Diesel and Dust. Its legacy whispers to us still: eliminate fascism, fight for peace, fight for freedom, and never forget that even the simplest engine can change the course of history.